Other areas of high oath-taking were the plains around Paris, and other areas of high oath-taking were the plains around Paris, the Pyrenees, and above all, the southeast, Provence and Dauphiné, whose underpaid congruists had been prominent in the clerical revolts of the early 1780s against episcopal despotism. Many big provincial cities, however, saw high levels of refusal, as did most peripheral regions. Less than a quarter of the beneficed clergy took the oath in most districts of Flanders and Alsace, areas culturally distinct from the French heartland. Languedoc, riddled with Protestants who had appropriated the revolution for their own ends, produced few clergy willing to endorse the new order. Above all, there was a massive refusal on the oath throughout the West. West of a line roughly from Rouen to La Rochelle, there were only isolated pockets where more than a quarter of clerics accepted the oath. Here, priests had often lived well on their own tithes and extensive glebe, and they tended to be of local peasant stock, which was even more important than material considerations. Everywhere, pressure from the laity seems to have been crucial in the decision priests took. Local authorities and clubs went to great lengths to promote acceptance, and where there was popular support, they achieved successes. But in the Bocage country of the West, where the new local authorities were townsmen already disliked for having done too well out of the revolution, priests preferred solidarity with their parishioners. In many regions, in fact, the oath acted as a sort of opinion poll on the work of the revolution so far, and a priest's decision to become a refractory or a constitutional reflected his parishioners' opinion on a far wider range of issues than the civil constitution of the clergy. In the end, about 54% of the parish clergy took the oath. This suggests that well over a third of the country was now prepared to signal that the revolution had gone far enough. Not only parish priests were subjected to the oath. All clergy who hoped for election to a benefice in the new constitutional church had to take it. Their chances of elevation in the hierarchy, non-existent before 1789, were enormously increased by a clean sweep of the episcopate, which all but 7 bishops refused to swear. Talleyrand, however, was there to assure the apostolic succession, and the constitutional church opened clerical careers to the talents. Many monks and canons, despite their ejection from the cloister, took the oath in order to qualify themselves for the cure of souls and a salary far better than the meager pension allotted to ex-regulars. And despite the civil constitution's drastic reduction in the number of parishes, refusal rates meant that there were plenty of benefices to be had. Too many, in fact, the National Assembly's first humiliation at the hands of the refractories came when it had to ask them to remain in office until suitable replacements could be found. Worse was to come. On 10th March, the Pope broke his silence with a private letter to the bishops who had signed the exposition of principles, criticizing the civil constitution at length. On 13 April, he asked them formally not to take the oath. On 4th May, these texts were made public, and although they still stopped short of explicit condemnation, all sides now took them for that. Many constitutionals now withdrew their oaths. In the end, perhaps 10%. In Paris, the Pope was burned in effigy, and hostile crowds prevented refractory priests and their congregations from exercising the freedom of worship vouchsafed as one of the rights of man and the citizen. The Assembly returned to debating the annexation of Avignon. At the end of the month, the papal nuncio left the country. The breach between revolutionary France and the Roman Church was complete. Only now did counter-revolution begin to acquire the makings of a popular base beyond the areas already torn by sectarian strife. Until the spring of 1790, there had indeed been no such thing as counter-revolution outside the overheated imaginations of the Count d'Artois and his threadbare émigré court in Turin. when, after the October days, Mounier had withdrawn to Dauphiné and attempted to reconvene the Dauphin estates with a view to denouncing the course events were now taking. His co-provincials rebuffed him. It was true, as early as September 1789, Mirabeau had begun to play a double game, continuing to boom radicalism from the tribune of the Assembly. He had offered the king and queen his secret services as an advisor. In May 1790, despite their loathing for him personally, they began to pay him for regular secret notes of advice. But Mirabeau wanted to arrest the revolution, not reverse it. He believed in a strong monarchy, and he believed that the king should be got out of Paris. But he had no time for the plotters of Turin and their schemes of resurrecting aristocratic power. Louis XVI, in any case, took none of Mirabeau's advice, and he died in April 1791, a frustrated man, though with his patriotic reputation still intact. But nor did the king pay much heed to the messages smuggled in from Artois, as the latter told Cologne, whose counsel he was increasingly taking throughout 1790. We must serve the king and the queen in spite of themselves. By then, in fact, his agents were in touch with Catholic leaders in the Guard. In that autumn, they felt so encouraged by reports of unrest in the southeast that they began to plan a general insurrection, taking in the whole of the Rhone Valley. But security was always to prove even less the counter-revolution's strong point than realism. And in December, plotters were arrested in Lyon with papers that exposed the whole conspiracy. In February 1791, a second Camp de Gilles failed in its objective of rallying overwhelming numbers of Catholic National Guards to march on Nimes. A largely Protestant force hunted down the ill-coordinated insurgents with considerable bloodshed. By then, Artois' support for such episodes was causing severe embarrassment to the King of Sardinia, who began to make clear that the émigré court was no longer welcome in Turin. In January 1791, the affronted exiles decided to leave, and by June they had found themselves a new headquarters in Germany at Koblenz. The territory, appropriately enough, of a prince of the church, the Archbishop Elector of Trier. Louis XVI, warned of the Lyons plot, had begged his brother not to go through with it. In any case, It had deepened for its ultimate success on the cooperation of loyal troops. And by the summer of 1790, it was uncertain whether any units of the army could be completely relied on. Antagonism between aristocratic officers and ranks, influenced by unhierarchical National Guard units, erupted into a series of mutinies in Lille, Hesdin, Perpignan, and Metz. They culminated in July and August with the rebellion of 3 regiments stationed at Nancy, energetically supported by the local Jacobin Club. General Bouillet, supreme commander in the eastern departments, resolved to make an example of them and took Nancy by storm. 23 mutineers were executed and savage punishments imposed on over 100 more. Despite uproar in the assembly at these echoes of ancient regime despotism, the example seemed to work. Effervescence in the army diminished over the winter, and the king came to regard Bouillet as someone whom he could perhaps rely on. The queen had been dreaming of flight and or rescue by her Austrian brothers' armies ever since the summer of 1789. But it seems to have been only towards the end of 1790, even as he was urging his exiled brother to drop rescue plans, that the king began to think seriously about escaping on his own initiative. It was ironic that he should be inclining this way just as the prospects for a popular rallying to the royal cause were beginning to brighten. And doubly so in that both developments could be ascribed to the same cause, the religious schism. It was true that the king had duly sanctioned both the civil constitution and the clerical oath, but he had done so with clear misgivings. And when huge numbers of clergy refused the oath and the Pope remained ominously silent, his personal doubts were reinforced. His confessor subscribed, but from then on the king refused to consult him. The most important women in his life after the queen, his maiden aunts, also spurned the constitutional clergy. When in February 1791, they begged to be allowed to go to Rome to consult the Pope in person, the king himself supervised arrangements for them to leave prematurely and unmolested. Crowds of women who were now the mainstay of popular demonstrations in the capital arrived just too late to prevent them. Encouraged by the Jacobins, the popular press, and the more radical Cordelier Club, or more formally, Society of the Friends of the Rights of Man, pointedly not the Constitution, they mounted menacing demonstrations outside the residences of other members of the royal family, suspecting a plan for piecemeal immigration. Lafayette and his National Guards spent much of the spring of 1791 rushing around Paris, dispersing anti-royal and anti-clerical demonstrations. Vilified by the popular press and hated by the popular political societies, which the Cordeliers were attempting to foster all over the capital, he won no gratitude either from the king or his devotees. Lafayette saw himself as the protector of royalty. They considered him its guerrier. He could not even, they thought, guarantee the security of his charge, for he always seemed to arrive almost too late. On 28th February, he was out of Vincennes trying to prevent a militant crowd from demolishing the keep there, a Bastille look-alike. Fearing the king was unprotected, hundreds of nobles armed with knives and pistols converged on the Tuileries. It looked like an escape plot, and Lafayette hurried back to conclude this day of daggers by disarming everybody in the palace. The contempt of royalists for this posturing mayor of the palace reached a peak in April, in Easter week, as in 1790, the royal family intended to spend Easter on the wooded western heights above the city at St. Cloud. But the Sunday before, the king publicly received communion from a refractory priest. Soon the whole city knew, and when, the next morning, the royal family attempted to set out for St. Cloud, a huge crowd surrounded their carriage and prevented it from moving. Lafayette, arriving late as usual, ordered National Guardsmen to clear the way. They refused. After almost 2 hours, the king went back into the palace. There is no evidence that the excursion to St. Cloud was part of an escape plan, but its abandonment convinced the king that he now really was a prisoner of his godless capital. From this moment, rumors and predictions of his impending flight became self-fulfilling. He began to make concrete preparations for his own immigration. Meanwhile, popular persecution of refractories intensified. In one incident, market women publicly caned a whole convent of nuns who had punished pupils for attending a constitutional mass. Threats of the same treatment prevented refractory congregations from using disused churches they had hired for private worship. And all this lawlessness took place against a background of rising unemployment in the capital, as droves of servants and workers in the luxury trades were thrown onto the streets. by noble immigration or retrenchment and the wholesale closure of chapters and monasteries. Public charity workshops, the most famous of which was dismantling the Bastille, took up some of the unemployment. This was where the idea of demolishing the keep at Vincennes came from. With so much labor on the market, wages had not risen much since 1789, but as depreciating assignats began to drive coin out of circulation, prices were beginning to go up. On 2nd March 1791, the National Assembly addressed a problem shelved in August 1789. It abolished trade guilds and corporations as vestiges of a now vanished society based on privilege. But guilds had also been employers' associations, and their disappearance now encouraged various groups of workers to press for higher wages. Most prominent among them were the carpenters and blacksmiths, who by early June were hinting darkly at a general coalition of 80,000 workers determined to force masters into paying more. The carpenters were talking of a minimum wage enforced by strikes, and popular societies were encouraging them. The municipality made increasingly frantic attempts to resist the movement. But at length, the National Assembly itself felt obliged to intervene. On 14 June, on the motion of Le Chapelier, it voted to prohibit all organizations of workers and concerted industrial action of any sort. Local authorities were forbidden to accept representations from such groups or offer any sort of employment to their members. This law was to govern industrial relations in France for the next 73 years. The fact that it was moved by Le Chapelier was significant. Here was one of the leading radicals of the early revolution, a founder member of the Jacobin Club, and for long one of the pacemakers of the left in the assembly. But by 1791, he had become convinced that the revolution could go no further without imperiling the gains made since 1789. The time had come to consolidate, complete the Constitution, and get it working before popular passions undermined it completely. Many hitherto radical deputies were coming to similar conclusions, sensing the change of mood in the last weeks of 1790. A group of former monarchians established a monarchical club to rival the Jacobins. Soon it had hundreds of members, but it compromised itself with too blatant a bid for popular support when, during the cold winter weather, it began to sell heavily subsidized bread. The Jacobins were able to badger the city authorities into closing it down for disrupting the market. Barnave led this campaign, but by early summer even he had begun to moderate his views, as had his old radical allies Duport and the Lameth brothers. They had begun to realize that, should the king abscond, the keystone of the whole Constitution would be lost with incalculable consequences. Besides, there was also the question of power after the constituent completed its work, which everyone now expected to be in the summer. Deputies, who had taken a lead in national life for 2 years, could hardly view the prospect of a return to provincial obscurity with much enthusiasm. To conciliate the king would open the way to office, especially now that Mirabeau was gone. But the drift of the Barnave, Duport, and Lameth triumvirate towards the centre ground of the politics rapidly aroused popular suspicion and brought to favor a number of hitherto obscure deputies on the left, whom Mirabeau, in one of his last speeches on 28 February 1791, had identified as the 30 Voices. The British ambassador was even more explicit about their aims. There is a set of men, he reported on 15 April, whose object is the total annihilation of monarchy, however limited. Their leader, he observed, was Robespierre. Whether Robespierre was at this stage Republican is doubtful. Certainly, he denied it in the Jacobin Club on 10th of April. But another British observer saw beyond these professions. He is, noted W.A. Miles, who had joined the Jacobin Club to report on its activities to London, in his heart Republican, honestly so, not to pay court to the multitude, but from an opinion that is the very best, if not the only, form of government which men ought to admit. Upon this principle he acts, and the public voice is decidedly in favor of his system. He is a stern man, rigid in his principles, plain, unaffected in his manners, no foppery in his dress, certainly above corruption, despising wealth. I watch him very closely every night. I read his countenance with eyes steadily fixed on him. He really is a character to be contemplated. He is growing every hour into consequence, and, strange to relate, the whole National Assembly holds him cheap, consider him as insignificant, and when I mention to one of them my suspicions, and said he would be a man of sway in a short time and govern the millions, I was laughed at. This was on 1st March. 5 weeks later, on 7 April, came Robespierre's first tangible achievement. Playing on old suspicions that had blighted Mirabeau's hopes of office in November 1789, he moved that no deputy should be eligible for executive office until 4 years after the constituent ended. The motion was carried. So was the next one on 16th of May, which excluded members of the constituent from the subsequent legislative assembly. Both were profoundly important for the subsequent course of the revolution, but at the time they seemed little more than tactical victories. Right-wingers supported them to spite the triumvirs, gleeful to see the fragmentation of the left. The fragmentation continued throughout May and early June, when the assembly returned to debating Avignon. Robespierre and his group called for instant annexation, this time unsuccessfully. The majority were beginning to recognize the risks in further alienating the Pope. Much time was also devoted to colonial questions, which had dogged the history of the Assembly ever since 8th of June 1789, when a deputation from Saint Domingue had demanded recognition. In March 1790, the deputies had voted not to abolish slavery on the recommendation of a committee chaired by Barnave. Evidently, the rights of man did not extend to blacks. But what about the free coloreds? Whites in Saint Domingue, where there were almost 40,000 of them, were determined to resist their claims to political rights. And when in October 1790, a small group attempted to assert themselves by force of arms, they were brutally repressed. Others now petitioned the Assembly, where Barnave warned of the dangers of meeting their claims, while Robespierre denounced slavery and called for the political rights to be granted regardless of color. Once more, he carried the day. Now, too, he was beginning to dominate the Jacobin Club, and his popularity in Paris was demonstrated when on 11th of June he was elected public prosecutor at the criminal court. None of this was calculated to reassure the royal family. And during all these controversies, their plans for flight were gradually elaborated. The king was now indifferent to attempts to conciliate him. He gave all his attention to composing a defiant manifesto which he proposed to leave behind, denouncing all that had been done since October 1789 and much before that. The arrangements were made by the Queen's devoted admirer, the Swedish adventurer Count Axel von Fersen. Through him, Bouillé was contacted. He promised to provide military escorts when the royal fugitives made the dash for Montmédy, close to the Luxembourg frontier. The troops would think that they were being moved up to observe Austrian forces massing on the other side, with the cooperation of the emperor, and in any case, the royal party would travel incognito. Under a specially prepared passport. The night of 20th of June, they slipped out of the Tuileries, past guards which had been doubled at renewed rumors of just such an attempt. Despite delays, they got clean away. But delay meant that the first escort had abandoned its post before the royal coach got there, thinking the enterprise had failed. This was the word that now went up the line of further escorts. At the same time, however, all these troop movements had aroused suspicion at towns along the route. National guards were called out, and at Saint-Ménehould, on the evening of 21st June, the king was recognized. Drouet, the local postmaster, whose claims to have made the identification launched him into a career in radical politics, made a dash to Varennes, the next town on the route. Here the party was stopped. The whole town turned out, and the troops waiting there could do nothing. On the morning of the 22nd, messengers arrived from Paris with orders to bring the would-be escapers back. The flight to Varennes was the revolution's second great turning point. Like the oath of the clergy, it forced everybody to make choices that most would have preferred not to face. Even if it had succeeded, choices would have been unavoidable. Whether the king merely intended, as he claimed, to go to Montmédy and negotiate from that safe distance, or whether, as most suspected, and his brother Provence, who at the same time did reach the Austrian Netherlands, put about, he intended to immigrate and return at the head of Austrian armies. The achievements of the revolution up to that moment would have been fundamentally challenged. Diplomats thought war would have been precipitated there and then. The failure of the attempted escape postponed that danger, but demanded choices of a different order. The monarch had renounced the revolution and had explained why at great length in the proclamation he left behind. He complained of imprisonment in Paris, violation of property, and complete anarchy in all parts of the empire. He denounced betrayal of the wishes expressed in the cahiers, the lack of power accorded to the crown under the new constitution, the tentacular power usurped by the Jacobin clubs, and implicitly the new religious order. How could such a man remain head of state? The blackest suspicions of the Parisian populace and radical leaders were confirmed. Republicans now came into the open. All over the capital, symbols of royalty were attacked and defaced. And on 24th June, the Cordeliers Club delivered a petition to the National Assembly to depose the king or consult the nation on his fate in a referendum. A crowd of 30,000 escorted its presenters. Most members of the National Assembly, however, had been thoroughly frightened by the king's departure. Its very behavior when the crisis broke paradoxically showed that public business should go on perfectly well without a king. Ministers were summoned, military dispositions checked, and debate proceeded as if nothing untoward had happened. "One would never have imagined," marveled one noble deputy, "that at this moment there was no longer a king in France." But to depose the king would mean at best a regency, notorious in French history for their perils, or at worst a complete redrafting of a constitution that was all but completed. Revisions in a public Republican direction could only lead to a strengthening of those popular forces, which increasing numbers of deputies had found so alarming over the spring. Within a day of the news of the flight breaking, however, the Assembly had found a way out of the dilemma. It would pretend, against all the evidence, that the king had been kidnapped. It said so in a proclamation issued on 22nd June, urging the nation to keep calm. The denunciations he had left behind had been wrested from an unwilling monarch by wicked advisors. Those who objected to such patent fictions were heavily voted down. The king was suspended from his functions For the rest of its life, the Constituent Assembly controlled the executive as well as made laws. But there was never any doubt that the vast majority of deputies were determined to retain the monarchy at the cost of however many fudges and fictions were required. On 15th of July, the entire blame for the flight was imputed by decree to Bouillet and his subordinates, who were to be prosecuted. By then, however, as the deputies well knew, most of the accused had immigrated and were safe in Austrian territory. The sense of an emergency at the news of Varennes was nationwide. There was a general expectation that the Austrians would invade to rescue the royal captive. National guards were stood to. Local authorities organized permanent committees to maintain revolutionary vigilance. And in many places, there was renewed persecution of refractory priests and their congregations. The assumption was that they were in league with aristocrats and foreigners in some vast plot. Jacobin clubs were filled to bursting with anxious patriots. The religious turmoil of the spring had revitalized the Jacobin network, with the need to drum up support for oath-taking and promote participation in the election of priests and bishops. By July, there were well over 900 affiliated clubs, almost 3 times as many as the start of the year. And in his parting manifesto, the king had pinpointed them as the source of much of what had gone wrong. But Varennes confronted the clubs with serious problems. Many of their members clearly thought that the king's betrayal of his trust ought to lead to his deposition. At least 60 clubs called for him to be put on trial, but only a handful called openly for a republic, and many others explicitly repudiated the idea. It was soon apparent that the mother society itself was split. Few speakers in its debates seemed to find the Assembly's policy satisfactory. But outright republicanism also found few supporters. Even Robespierre only advocated leaving the decision to the people. But the club felt unable to resist the sense of outrage which swept Paris on 15 July when it became known that the Assembly held the king blameless. That evening, its meeting was swamped by a crowd of 4,000 organized by a hitherto obscure radical club called the Social Circle. Before Varenne, the Social Circle had been noted for somewhat utopian political discussions, but afterwards it had cooperated with the Cordeliers in their call for a republic and had publicized their petition of 24 June in its newspaper, the Bouche de Fer, Iron Mouth. The intruders now urged the Jacobins to join them in drawing up a petition against the king's reinstatement. They hoped to attract mass signings by promulgating it on the altar to the fatherland, which had been erected on the Champ de Mars for the celebration of the second anniversary of the fall of the Bastille the day before. A joint committee was set up to draft the petition overnight. Among those elected to it were Danton and Brissot, who had built himself a democratic reputation in Paris through his newspaper, the Le Patriote Français, and his activities in the Social Circle. But as finally drafted and published in the Bouche de Fer the next afternoon, the petition declared that the king had abdicated. It was in effect a Republican manifesto, and its result was to split the Jacobin Club. Lafayette, the Lameths, and the majority of its active members were committed monarchists, and they now seceded. They took with them every deputy except Robespierre, his close ally Pétion, and one or two others, and set themselves up as a rival club, meeting in the former convent of the Feuillants. Robespierre was appalled at the fragmentation of his most secure platform, and after a heated debate, he persuaded the rump of the Jacobins to withdraw their support for the petition. It was too late. The Feuillants were only too delighted to have shed their radical colleagues. In any case, the Cordeliers had now taken up the petition and were determined to push ahead with the signing ceremony. On 17 July, accordingly, perhaps 50,000 people gathered on the Champ de Mars. By late afternoon, 6,000 had signed. But long before that, two unfortunates found hiding beneath the patriotic altar were lynched by excited and suspicious crowds. And this gave Bailly, as mayor of Paris, an excuse for declaring martial law under the decree of October 1789. Lafayette and the National Guard now marched to the Champ de Mars and flying the red flag warning. They were greeted with a hail of stones and some shots. Thereupon, they opened fire on the largely unarmed crowd, shooting them down, as one participant put it, like chickens. Perhaps 50 people were killed and several more wounded as the crowd scattered. In the weeks that followed the massacre of the Champ de Mars, another 200 or so known activists in the Parisian popular movement were arrested. Although Danton escaped to England and Desmoulins and Marat went into hiding, it seemed that the nascent Republican movement had been broken. Radical newspapers ceased to publish. The Cordeliers and the social circles ceased to meet, and the latter never resumed. Even the Jacobins had been shattered, and the Feuillants drafted a confident manifesto to provincial affiliates, inviting them to recognize the new club as the only legitimate society of the Friends of the Constitution. Untroubled, therefore, by further popular pressure, the Constituent Assembly now set about producing a final and definitive version of the Constitution on which it had labored for 2 years. In this process, Lafayette and the Triumvirate, bitter rivals down to June 1791, cooperated. Barnave, who, as one of the Assembly's commissioners, sent to escort the royal family back from Varennes, had been captivated by the Queen. Took a lead in trying to secure last-minute amendments that would make Constitution more acceptable to the king. They scored some successes. The civil constitution of the clergy was excluded from the Constitution. That meant an oath to the Constitution did not imply acceptance of the new ecclesiastical order, and also that the civil constitution might be amended or even replaced as an ordinary law without going through the deliberately cumbrous 10-year process laid down for changing the Constitution itself. Meanwhile, a proposal that all refractory priests should be ordered not to come within 30 miles of any place where they had been beneficed was thrown out as inflammatory. In a disingenuous gesture, the silver mark qualification for election as a deputy, which had proved a particularly useful issue for rallying the Parisian popular societies in the spring, was abolished. But qualifications for voting in secondary electoral assemblies, which actually chose deputies, were raised to a level far above the silver mark to put control of the important levers of power securely in the hands of very rich landowners. In any case, by the time these amendments passed on 27th of August, the elections to the subsequent legislative assembly had already been held, and all those chosen had had to pass the silver mark test. Finally, the Fulons were able to carry a law to restrict the freedom of the press, holding press license responsible for much of the popular effervescence curbed. It was hoped finally in July, the Assembly decreed on 23rd August, against the lonely opposition of Robespierre, that any writer who deliberately provokes disobedience to the law, disparagement of the constituted powers, and resistance to their acts might be prosecuted, and that public officials whose probity or honest intentions were impugned might sue for damages. The Lameths and Malouet, who unlike them had always believed in such safeguards, also dreamed of making the royal veto absolute, allowing deputies to be ministers, and even a second chamber. But it was too late now to revive the monarchian program of 1789. The king was to be asked to accept a constitution the same in all but detail as had been envisaged ever since the laying of its cornerstones in 1789. Nor was it at all certain that Louis XVI would accept it. Bombarded with conflicting advice from both France and abroad, he seemed undecided until the very last minute. Sometimes he seemed resolved to try to make the Constitution work. On 31st July, he wrote to Artois asking him to return to the country and abandon his counter-revolutionary plottings. The next day, the Assembly provided sterner incentives for passing the first law, imposing penalties on émigrés. They were summoned to return within a month on pain of subjection to triple taxation. Now, for the first time too, official lists of émigrés were to be drawn up. The first proposal for such a law had come the preceding February, but it had been defeated when Mirabeau denounced it. Since that time, however, the stream of immigration had swelled enormously. especially after Varennes, already alienated by a new oath of loyalty to the nation, the law, and the king in that order, imposed on 11th June, army officers were outraged by the Varennes debacle. Bouillé's immigration was followed over the next 6 months, and by the disappearance of perhaps 6,000 of his fellow officers, well over half the officer corps of the entire army. The flow was not staunched by the abrogation of the new law against immigration on 14 September. As part of a general amnesty to mark the promulgation of the Constitution. By this time, discipline throughout the army had all but collapsed amid new mutinies. Many officers who might have been prepared to stay were positively driven out. In aristocratic circles, in fact, the Feuillants received no credit for their efforts to restore a national consensus around a constitutional king. Every effort was made to block them. And the Assembly nobles, or as they were now being called, blacks, or ci devants, hithertos, either abstained from voting or took a perverse pleasure in supporting Robespierre and Pétion, despite its avowedly conservative aims. Few right-wingers joined the Feuillant Club, yet it also failed spectacularly to win over most of the provincial clubs. Only 72 severed their links with the Jacobins, and many of those had drifted back by the end of the summer. When martial law was lifted early in August and newspapers began to reappear, no important Parisian journal came out for the Feuillants. Nothing did more to keep politics polarized than rumors of war, which persisted throughout the summer. The left assumed that the flight to Varennes had been part of an international conspiracy to crush the revolution, and that, indeed, was what the Queen and the émigrés had hoped to forge. When the flight failed, all sides assumed that the German powers would now redouble their efforts, and that the crumbling French army would not be able to stand up to them. On 10th of July, in fact, Padua Circular, issued by the Emperor Leopold, invited fellow monarchs to join him in a campaign to restore the liberty of the French royal family. But only the King of Prussia responded positively, and the result was merely a further appeal for concerted action when the two monarchs met at Pillnitz on 27th of August.